1 week since the midair collision in Washington, D.C., we speak to someone who was also flying in the sky over our nation's capital at the very same time. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Before I launch into more reporting on this news story, I think it's appropriate to pause. The news moves so fast from one topic to the next. We can easily just strip the humanity from the stories we cover, and I feel that too. 67 people died last Wednesday in a completely sudden moment in time when a midair collision happened between a Black Hawk helicopter and a regional jet. I've never ever covered a story like this, and I've covered a lot of different aviation stories in the past. We want to cover this story responsibly, in part to honor those impacted, which is absolutely a priority. We also want to cover it to understand what did happen in the hopes that it will never happen again. And so you can also make your own decisions. I couldn't help but ask a very simple question over the last few days, a natural question. Should I avoid flying into Reagan Airport because of this? What other airports should we all be concerned about? Because there's a lot of helicopter traffic around many of our airports. But this incident happened distinctly at an airport a 10-minute drive from the White House. And that makes it even more unique than any other setting. Investigators are trying to piece together information and share it with the public at a regular cadence. And for that, we're really grateful. The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, has regularly briefed the press, but none of them were there in the air that night. And I was able to talk to someone who was a first responder who at the time of the crash was out working in a helicopter on a completely separate assignment nearby. And we had this conversation on background, so I have permission to share some of what I learned. And for that, I am so grateful because it really helped clarify a few important points. Let me preface our conversation with one important fact, though. The NTSB says an initial report on this incident will be available about 30 days from the accident. So maybe late February, early March. A probable cause of the crash and a more complete telling of contributing factors will come in 1 or 2 years. That's the timeline. And I share this because it's a reminder that the information we have is very, very preliminary. So with that disclaimer, let me just set the scene. What was that night like for anyone flying in the area? It was one of the first questions I asked. And it was described to me as a fairly typical night, kind of windy, gusty, and not crazy constant blowing winds, but there was some wind, nothing particularly alarming about the weather or any other factor. And when the call came out to other aircrafts in the area, it was very clear very fast that something was really wrong. And for someone who saw the scene, it was very clear very fast how destructive it was. One of the big news items from investigators over the last few days is that early data from the regional jet was that it was flying at around 325 feet at the time of the collision. A separate data set showed the helicopter was flying at around 200 feet. So clearly there's a discrepancy. This isn't right because the aircrafts collided. So one of those altitude readings is wrong. Right now, the flight data recorder of the helicopter has been recovered, but it doesn't have timestamps. So it will take a moment to manually sync this, according to the NTSB. So why are these altitude measurements and specifically the 200 feet mark really important? Well, one of the things I learned is that 200 feet is typically the recommended altitude for helicopters around DC. DC is a crowded airspace. There's a lot going on. However, in most places, a commercial aircraft is likely not at 200 feet unless they're close to landing. And that's true anywhere, not just in DC. But if you're in a helicopter and you're staying that low, you will mostly stay out of the aircraft's way unless you're also right at the airport. So that's why that matters. The question really remains right now is the following. Was the helicopter actually at 300 plus feet, much higher than recommended? And if that's the case, then why? Was that a choice to fly higher? In a gusty night, did a hard wind unknowingly lift the helicopter momentarily? Were they avoiding something else in the air? Did orientation at night or ambient lights play a factor where they didn't realize quite how high they were? Sort of like when you're driving 55 miles per hour and you look down and suddenly you realize you're going 70. Did they just lose track for any reason? Other questions remain too, though. What about the paths of both of these aircrafts? Nothing has been reported atypical about the path of the plane or the altitude, at least at right now. Something of interest for the helicopter, though, that I learned a little bit about. Typically, a helicopter would hug the shoreline of DC. The path of this helicopter, moments before the incident, seems to jut out over the Potomac River. This is why the collision happened over water. It's not that a helicopter wouldn't fly over the river, it certainly would, but hugging the shoreline is a more typical habit. And one thing I'll just kind of flag for you, I've seen a few different graphic mock-ups of the helicopter's path that draw where they flew in different ways. Sometimes the helicopter is more obviously suddenly out over the river. In others, it's a gradual move. And this is something to pay attention to because we don't really know what's what. Again, from a person with knowledge of this airspace, though, if you hug the shoreline at around 200 feet, you're generally out of the way of aircraft. That said, so much of what we have learned is pretty normal. The route the helicopter was flying in general, the plane's path, both of those were not out of the ordinary. The request by the helicopter pilot for visual separation, a sign that they were going to look around and navigate, that was not irregular. And as my interview confirmed, for the most part, this night was very much business as usual until it wasn't. So what happened in a split second that changed the course of history? We're going to be watching altitude, and we'll be watching to learn anything out of the ordinary. And we certainly do hope to learn more. One final question I asked my source is the following. Does this really happen all the time? Near misses that the public doesn't hear about with helicopters and planes in DC. He has more than 15 years experience in this area. And I was surprised by his answer. He told me no. It's certainly not without risk or an occasional heads up or a bumpy ride periodically, but coming so close to disaster was something he had not experienced. And we hope and pray that's the case for always, for all of us. So we'll keep you posted as this story develops. I hope you find this helpful. Thank you to our expert for sharing his perspective and his thoughts and for his work as a first responder. And thank you for supporting quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news.